In our last conversation, we looked carefully, read through a portion of Paul's letter to Ephesians chapter 2. And we see there that Jesus is personified, or peace is personified in the person of Jesus himself. Paul writes, as I explained, that Jesus is our peace. As his followers, we know that the scripture states that Jesus has destroyed the dividing wall of hostility between our peoples, between men and women, between Jews and people from the nations. Yet in our hearts, as we participate in conflict, the temptation always is to re-erect the dividing wall. We need to be asking ourselves, why do we do that? Practically speaking, here in Netanya, in the heart of the Sharon Valley, we live in the narrowest portion of the nation. It is only 16 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea to the what we know as the Green Line, the beginning of the West Bank. There is a straight road, literally going through the heart of my city, that leads out to the West Bank, 16 kilometers. In driving terms, 15-20 minute drive, somebody can be in the heart of Netanya. During the terrible days of the Intifada, coming up in the year beginning in October of 2000, going on into 2001, and for the coming 5 years, those terrible years, we saw all the atrocities of suicide bombing rise up, bringing the nation into a state of terrible fear. Here in this very vulnerable, narrow part of the country, we became known as the soft underbelly of the nation. And I remember in the first 6 months of the Intifada of the year 2001, there were countless suicide and bombing atrocities in my city that literally brought the whole city of about 180,000 people to its knees in fear and anger. The whole psyche of our city changed. It was terrible. During those days, the Israeli government made a decision to begin to erect the dividing wall, as it's known, between the Palestinian territories and the rest of the nation of Israel. It became actually known as the separation wall, and it remains there, and hundreds of kilometers of it are now built. But in those early days, the first section was built right here beside Netanya, because we were so very vulnerable here. Those of us living in my city, initially we rejoiced at the building of this wall, because virtually overnight the atrocities, the suicide bombings stopped. But somehow deep in my heart, because already I was walking for many years, developing fellowship and relationship with my Palestinian brothers and sisters, suddenly this part of me became deeply disturbed. Our people were now truly physically divided. How would this affect the fellowship of followers of Messiah from both sides of the now existing checkpoints? Many of us discovered that for us to regard ourselves as true disciples, we must commit ourselves to being pursuers of peace. This is no longer an option, even at the cost at times of social loyalties, and even at the cost of having our own precious belief systems challenged. In accepting God's call on our lives to reconciliation, we also have to be very aware of the obstacles to reconciliation, those things that limit or prevent us from drawing close to one another in fellowship, at least in this context of the Israeli Palestinian conflict. I want to look at briefly, but I want to look at 5 of these obstacles, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but 5 of these things, and look at them in view of what God is doing in our lives and what the Scripture is saying. The first obstacle that we face, first obstacle to reconciliation, is the fact that our conflict is very complex. Politicians and diplomats, some of the best minds throughout the world, have attempted to work out a solution for coexistence between our two peoples for decades. But the political situation, however, fails to mend the relationships between the two communities. Why are we failing? Why have these all attempts failed? The millions upon millions of dollars that have been poured in to every initiative. Failure. Attitudes of hatred and prejudice, you must understand, begin at a very early age in our society. When I was serving as a combat soldier in the city of Hebron, in the midst of the city of the patriarchs, but right deep in the heart of the West Bank, God showed me through another incident there why we were getting no closer to resolution. Where was the real problem lying? As I was serving with my unit there, one day we were given the duty of guarding a compound where a large group of ultra-Orthodox Jewish families were living and bringing up their children. They had a synagogue there, and this was right in the heart of Hebron. And so I looked on this. It was a morning hours, a beautiful day, and my comrade at arms and myself, we were happy because we were looking forward to coffee and cakes and biscuits that were inevitably going to be brought to us from the families. But we'd only been there at the gate maybe 20 minutes or so. In the fairly early morning, already people were on their way to work, and Palestinian Muslims were going by. Women were heading towards the local shuk, the local market. Suddenly, there were 2 small children, a little boy and a little girl, his sister, age of approximately 6 and 4 years old, suddenly ran down a stairway within the compound behind us, Jewish children, and ducked out through the gateway between our legs. We were just leaning against the fence there. And they stood on the side of the road and began cursing the Muslim Arab ladies that were walking by on their way to the market, cursing them and then reaching down and throwing handfuls of stones on them. And we just looked in horror because we thought, oh my gosh, this could cause a major international incident. I asked my comrade to guard the gate, and I grabbed these 2 kids under my arms with a rifle on my back. I ran up the stairway to the home where I saw them come out from, and I knocked on the door of their apartment with my boot, and the mother came to the door, and she said, "What are you doing with my kids?" And I shoved them through the doorway, and I explained to her briefly that this is what your children had been doing. And instead of thanking me for rescuing her children, she turned on me and said, "How dare you interfere with my children? They have every right to express themselves in whatever way they want." This is a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And at that moment, I understood very deeply that our problems ran very deeply from a young age. That all the efforts towards reconciliation by the diplomatic community, the political community, was not touching it where the real hatred was beginning. course, these children are learning these things from their own homes, and we are very aware that these values or lack of values, these attitudes, this hatred, this racism is being instilled in our children from both communities, even in our education systems at times. So we begin to understand just how deep and how complex these obstacles are. Secondly, we need to look at the obstacle of a thing we call collective memory. Collective memory are those ways that we intentionally perpetuate our own perception of history, our own historical narratives, and how we perpetuate them to successive generations by way of our education systems and by way of our commemorations year after year. We do this even in our respective faith communities. Some of these memories are very painful and are kept alive by commemorating them year after year. For example, each year we Israelis, we celebrate independence. We celebrate the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, and while on that same day our Palestinian neighbors commemorate, do not celebrate with us, but commemorate a thing they call Nakba in Arabic, the day of great tragedy, where they experienced their subsequent displacement. The formation of the state as a Jewish homeland for my people, for them, resulted in displacement, loss of dignity, occupation, all sorts of things that would follow until today. To try and understand this dynamic better, we in our reconciliation ministry began to bring together groups of leaders, people that we'd walk with for some time and could trust, and to really learn to step into one another's shoes, to hear one another, to experience things like what happened in 1948, and to hear it from one another's perspective. When we did that, God moved our hearts to compassion and sensitivity. It broke down some of the barriers. These were just simply beginning to be willing to hear one another and one another's perspectives. In the next program, I want to look at 2 or 3 other obstacles to reconciliation. One of them is going to be on the enormous imbalance of power between our respective communities. Another one will be what happens when we begin to dehumanize one another. The sort of thing that happened to me as I was body searching that young man down in Gaza so many years ago. What happened to him as he looked upon me as not as a man, but as a soldier in uniform. I also will look at the obstacle of our respective identities and how that can affect the way we are willing to reach towards one another in fellowship. So I invite you to walk on with me as we look at these things and then look at the true answer to these obstacles through the one that truly is our peace, the Messiah Jesus. God bless you all.